All right, viewers and listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good day and welcome to an interesting and exclusive interview, I would call it, with Professor Christopher J. Ferguson of Stetson University in Florida. He joins me right from his home in Orlando, there in Florida, and he's one of the, I would say, renowned American psychologists, experts in the field of psychology, and he has talked a lot, written a lot, presented a lot about the issue of social media and mental health, suicide, video games and their effects, an area that he has debunked, or whose traditional ideas he has debunked, that they are responsible. Violent video games are responsible or are among the responsible factors that make people develop violent attitude and behavior and make people violent and start shooting all over at people and so on and so forth. I'm sure he has been heavily criticized by his academic peers and other people because there are still people who believe that the violence that we see in movies help shape our own violent attitude and behavior in reality. And this is quite literature, because in literature, we believe that films, books are a reflection of the real life societies that we live in. And so, what we see in the movies can help shape our thinking, our beliefs, and our worldview, and so on and so forth. But Professor Christopher J. Ferguson tends to deviate and disagree with this traditional assertion, and so on and so forth. So, Professor, thank you very much indeed for speaking to me on Global Arena. I really appreciate it.
Sure thing. Well, thanks for having me on today. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let me get started from the beginning. Your own inspiration. How did you get inspired to become a psychologist? Where did you get your inspiration from?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it really wasn't super purposeful. It's not like I was like 7 and wanted to be a psychologist or anything. I think probably when I was younger, like a teenager and stuff, I mostly wanted to be like a rock star and all that. So this was kind of like Plan B, and it ended up, as I was teenager and then a young adult, I found that I was really bad at a lot of careers. So like, I had difficulty being on time, the 9 to 5 kind of work week thing. I don't like having a boss, it turns out. And it's kind of hard to find a job that you don't need those things. so I ended up in graduate school. And when I was in graduate school, I ended up teaching a couple classes, and I found that I was really good at it and really liked it. So that's one thing that I really seemed to have some skill at, and and it was emphasized at that time to me by other professors that professors don't punch a clock, they don't really have a boss per se. At least not one who's looking over their shoulder. So it's a very autonomous, career path, unusually autonomous career path. And so it was kind of really, it was the teaching that sort of got me interested at first. I mean, it's the closest you can be to being like a rock star, while still being mostly anonymous. You know what I mean? Like, you get these little performances every day, and you get at least like 30 people who think you're interesting, which is kind of cool, if you're good at it at least. And so that's kind of how I got started. And and with the video game stuff, it really was just I was initially interested in doing research like on criminals, and so it kind of was an accidental backdoor from that. Back in the early 2000s, people were talking about school shootings, and they played some sort of role in that, and people were very emphatic at the time about it. It wasn't just like, well, maybe they don't, maybe they do, but really, like, this is like cigarettes and lung cancer. The people were just absolutely sure, and that got me curious to look at the data a little bit more closely. And and it turned out the data did not appear to be as robust as you would expect for those kinds of claims that were being made. Sometimes by scholars, sometimes by politicians. So that got me curious, and it turns out it's a lot easier to do video game research than inmate research. So here I am, basically.
Yeah, definitely. There is this popular professor here in Kano He's a professor in our university. He's
Yeah.
called Professor Mekanu Madaki.
Hmm.
He spent a lot of time in American prisons doing some research
Yeah.
over there, and he studies well, the psychology, if I would say, and the sociology. Or he specializes in the prison stuff. And we
Yeah.
talked a lot about that. There was a time when I hosted him on one of my YouTube shows back then in 2022. I don't know. You said that you preferred, or you derailed from the initial course, that is studying the criminal minds and inmates and stuff like that. You think that was like a dangerous path to follow, and that was why you quit and you jumped into the video games world?
Yeah, no, I don't think it was so much that it was dangerous. I never really felt like threatened. When I worked, I was mostly in a county jail, as well as psychiatric hospitals. Of course, I worked in some of those as well, and juvenile detention. So, I mean, but most of the places, I mean, the most dangerous of all of them are really the psychiatric hospitals. I mean, I think because they don't have correction officers, right? They don't have these big like 7 feet tall guys who maintain the peace the way the jails do. And oftentimes the mental health staff are expected to be the ones that help maintain the police, or excuse me, not police, the peace. Whereas in a jail, I mean, if you're a mental health staff, you're not expected to be physically involved in any kind of altercation or anything. So I never, and most of the inmates like the mental health staff, because you're there to help and that kind of stuff, and they like research. When I was doing research in the jail, I was like in my early 30s, so I was still pretty young, late 20s, early 30s, and so I was basically still in the sort of cute college student phase, sort of thing, where everybody wanted to help me out. The nice students here, he just
Yeah.
wants to ask questions, and so I never felt, more than that, it's just harder, it's because you have to jump through so many hoops. There's a lot more protections around it, which is absolutely understandable. I mean, it's a vulnerable population, so it takes a lot more time, a lot more work. Whereas with video games, I could just have a bunch of college students play video games. You know what I mean? Like it's just so much easier to do research in the video game realm, and it's fun. And my university's bought me like PlayStations and Xboxes over the years, so it has a lot of perks.
That's
Well.
fantastic.
It is cool, and of course, like everybody's talking about, like it is like a high, not anymore. I mean, kind of people moved off of video games, at least in the U.S. somewhat. But certainly at the time, there was it was a high energy topic. Everybody was worried about it. I testified in D.C. several times about video game, effects and that kind of stuff. So it was it was cool. It was easy in the sense of getting at least the samples were pretty easy.
And it was fun.
It was fun. It was fun. It was good. For the most part, it was fun. I'll say there were unfun moments, but yeah, it definitely was mostly fun. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's absolutely. I don't know. Just let me ask you this question before we move on. I don't know. Prisons in Nigeria are very, very much in a bad shape because there's a lot of overcrowding, and there are some challenges there. What sort of how would you describe the nature of prisons and correctional services or correctional centers in the US? Are they as crowded as they are elsewhere? And are they as we see them in films, movies like Prison Break, where they
People
yeah,
get murdered every day.
yeah,
Probably somewhere in between. You know what I mean? Like, nobody's going to tell you it's a utopia, right? It's and probably you talk about like where are the best prisons in the world. Usually people mention like Sweden, right? Where they look like a country club, kind of thing. So I would, from my experience, guess that American prisons are maybe not as bad as prisons in much of the developing world, but like whether it's, I'm not familiar with Nigeria specifically, but certainly like Mexico or places like that. But still have, I don't want to name you. There's still significant, unpleasantries, around them. The overcrowding has actually gotten better, I believe. That historically in the 90s and early 2000s, I think U.S. prisons were very overcrowded. Our prison population is still unusually high, but it has dropped. So I think that has eased things. For the most part, most prisons you're not going to get murdered, on a daily basis, sort of thing. It's mostly like what they call the maximum security or the supermax, the very most dangerous inmates. Probably if you were to think of like a typical prison, like a medium security prison, and I've been to some of those as well. It's kind of like think of like high school on steroids is kind of what there are fights. Most people don't get murdered in them. The fights are over stupid things. I mean, it happens. Again, you and I would not want to go there, but at the same point, it's probably not as horrid as the TV shows make them out to be. People still find friends. They have activities. They're loud. That's the one thing I do hear a lot about is that people talk about like sleep problems and that kind of stuff in the prisons because you're in with hundreds of other people in this massive building and that kind of stuff. So I don't want to namby the real challenges. On the other hand, I don't want to buy into this idea that it's like hell on earth necessarily either. So they're not great, but they're not probably as horrible as you think they are.
Yeah, well, one interesting thing that you have said is the way they are portrayed in films and movies as dangerous places where people get murdered by the big, huge, giant guys. There, of course. Well, and nothing could be done. Yeah, because that's what we see in the movies, and that's why we may have this kind of attitude and thinking that okay, prisons in America are sort of a dangerous place for someone to find themselves in.
Yeah, and again, I won't say it never happens. I mean, obviously, assaults and homicides do happen in prisons, but it's just not. Again, and it's going to vary by prison. Certainly, also jails are different. Most people in jails are not there for long sentences. They're there for relatively minor offenses, although they do also include people that are waiting trial for more serious sentences. But the prisons vary between like minimum security, maximum security, medium security. So when you're looking at those TV shows that are showing like the violent gangs and rampant drug abuse and the regular assaults and homicides, you're probably thinking more like maximum security kind of places where you have the most dangerous offenders in those sorts of places. And I mean, I'm not going to say like there's not some truth to some of that, but again, TV shows are also going to like take something that's a kernel of truth and just blow it up on steroids, right? Because that's where the drama and the excitement, comes. So again, would I be thrilled to find myself being sent to a maximum security prison? Absolutely not. But on the other hand, would it be the way the TV shows show it to be, I also don't think it would be as bad. Again, not to say that it wouldn't be bad, but it wouldn't be as bad as the TV makes it look out to be, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And that's interesting to hear this. But I don't know that it's true you have ever come across this because someone was telling me that prisons in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, and places like Norway, Finland, Denmark and Sweden are sort of I don't know, are not as crowded as they are in the United States of America because the crime rates have dramatically and drastically dropped, are not as high as they are in the United States of America. I don't know whether it's true, but someone told us that there was a time when prisons were sort of closed in places like that. I don't know. Have you ever come across that?
Well, it certainly is true that the Scandinavian countries have some of the lowest crime rates in the world. There's no question about that. Even compared to the rest of Europe, to put that into context. So the U.S. actually doesn't have a terribly high crime rate per se. If you look at like violent crime overall, the U.S. is actually lower than some European countries. So we have a lower violent crime rate than the U.K., France, Belgium, places like that. What we do have a high rate of is homicides, right? Because we have a lot of guns. So it's very easy to turn an assault into a homicide because of basically anybody can get a firearm pretty easily here. So we do have a particular challenge around homicides. But if you look at our assault rate, you are much more likely to get assaulted in the UK or Australia or New Zealand or France or Belgium than you are in the United States. So we don't overall have a terribly high crime rate compared to Europe, but compared to Scandinavia, absolutely. Places like the Netherlands, Denmark, as you mentioned, also places like South Korea, there are other countries in other parts of the world that have very, very low crime. Japan, of course, you have very, 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 very abnormally low crime rates. Now, some of these some of these countries are seeing their crime rates go up. I think like Sweden's crime rate has been going up recently. It's still very low, however, but for itself, we're seeing some increase. Ireland's crime rate's been going up, although they actually had a fairly high assault rate to begin with. So and some of this is, if you think of like Denmark, like they're all the same. And I mean, like most people live in Denmark are Danish. You know what I mean? Like, and that seems like obvious, but you know what I'm talking about. Like their immigration rate has been pretty low over time. And so what you tend to find, and this may be a little bit of a controversy with immigration, like the U.S. actually benefits from immigration in a lot of ways because we tend to bring people to the U.S. First off, a fair amount of people who are high tech, so they have like advanced degrees, they're engineers and that kind of stuff. Not shockingly, they don't commit crimes because they make a lot of money. So, and then the people who are lower income who we do bring in, they tend to be mostly from Central or South America or Mexico, who are, as much as we think of them as culturally different, they actually are fairly culturally similar, so they have the same religious beliefs, they want the same things out of life, more or less, than we do. So we don't tend to have a lot of immigrants, we talk about it a lot, but Mexican Americans assimilate to American culture very, very easily, for instance. So by the point that by the third generation, they look American. You wouldn't be able to tell that they weren't white, like even physically, they just blend right in. Where I think where we're seeing some other countries that are struggling, like Germany, Sweden, they have an immigrant population that are mostly refugees. That's wonderful that they did that. But they may not be assimilating as well. They're lower income. They don't have jobs as often. They're culturally very different. And that's where sometimes you see, some problems with crime, begin to develop. You have a population of individuals who don't feel at home, in the country. And that can cause some problems, which is probably where you see like Germany, Sweden, some other places seeing some problems now. But Denmark just doesn't have that many. They're really tight with their immigration. They take all your money away when you come through the I'm not even kidding. Like they look for any like gold watches you have and take all your stuff. So they really people are like, oh, Americans are so bad with immigration, we're so against it. Like try Denmark or Australia. I mean, they don't mess around with their immigration policies. They're incredible, or Mexico for that matter has incredibly rigid, immigration policies, so a lot of other countries are much more rigorous, if you will, about scanning people as they come into the country than the U.S. is. I feel like I'm being awfully rah about the U.S. today. I don't mean to, but there are.
Do you personally share the Donald Trump's belief and opinion that migrants spoil the blood of the Americans and they come? No,
I wouldn't say that. No.
The truth and commit crimes.
No way did I mean to. I sometimes, there's smart immigration, there's not smart immigration, right? Where immigration works has nothing to do with race or blood or genetics or anything like that. Nobody should care about whether people coming are black or Latino. That doesn't matter at all. This whole idea about like preserving the white blood is really very silly. But on the other hand, there is this issue of like bringing people who have like, skills that we need is really, really super helpful. Now that might be engineering, that might be agriculture. It depends on what we happen to need at any given moment. So thinking about strategically, who would benefit the country is useful. Also, sometimes thinking about like values, like what values do the people have when they come in? Do they accept free speech? Do they accept that women should have equal rights as men? Do they, believe in the same kind of basic foundation of law that we do is useful, and sometimes where you see strife is, where you have a community of people who are refugees. And again, it's wonderful to welcome people in who are refugees who just don't share the same values, and then it's not that one side's right or wrong. One side might be right or wrong, but, sometimes it's just that is more difficult for two groups of people to assimilate. Now, that would be just as true for a bunch of Americans, going over to China as it would for, maybe, there's a lot of talk about like Syrian refugees, for instance, going to Germany, so, it's not that like one group's bad or one group's good. It's just that sometimes assimilation is more or less difficult based on where the two groups are starting from. That's why I said the U.S. has been lucky that bringing in Central South Americans and Mexican Americans, they mostly share the same values as white Americans do or Black Americans do, and so that's why you see this like really easy assimilation with Mexican Americans into the U.S. That may have been a bit more of a struggle for some other countries who are bringing in different groups. So it had nothing to do with like racial purity. To be very clear,
I understand.
No way.
Yeah, viewers would need some clarity, and that's why I put the question. Yeah, definitely. I decided to deliberately put the question so that the viewers would get the clarity they deserve. Yeah, definitely. So let me put this. I'm currently looking at the website of Gun Violence Archive. I'm sure it's a very popular website that belongs, I don't know, it's an organization, not even a government thing. The most important thing is that it's a very huge data. Homicide / murder and stuff like that. The total number of the total number of those that have been killed are somewhere around 15,000 people, 998 as of today, Monday, the 16th of December, and the total number of injuries 30,423. Mass shootings are somewhere around 487. And mass murders somewhere around 30. Number of children killed aged between 0 and 11 somewhere around 236. The injuries somewhere around 518. The numbers go on and on and on. The categorization, so above is like the total number of people that have been killed either in a mass shooting or homicide or murder and whatever. 15,000 people this year alone so far. What does that say about the United States of America? An unlivable place for people?
Yeah, so our homicide rate usually ranges somewhere between 10 to 20,000 in different years. So the peak was in the 1990s when it was about 20,000. We've seen a gradual decline since then. And probably the lowest was around 2018, 2019. We did have a small uptick after the sort of protests and riots after George Floyd was murdered. We had kind of a depolicing problem, and then now that seems to be slowly resolving itself. So the numbers are going back down again. So again, I think in terms of what does it say about the U.S.? I mean, again, if you look at our assault rate versus our homicide rate, like I mentioned, our assault rate is not that bad. Our assault rate is about the same as a mid-European country, Italy, say, but as you're pointing out, like our homicide rate is enormously high. Now, compared to like Venezuela, they have way more homicides, or Mexico, but we're comparing the U.S. to like Europe or South Korea or Japan. Compared to other developed nations, our homicide rate is very, very high. And I think very clearly the problem is that we just have a lot of guns. Right. So unlike the UK, you have to like chase somebody with a knife over there. Right? It's a lot of effort. Right. I mean, they beat the crap out of each other like crazy. I mean, you say the wrong thing about Manchester United and someone will kick your ass over there, which won't happen in the US, even if it's an American team. Right. We're chiller than the Brits or the French, but if people do get into an argument here, it's very easy for one of them to reach for their firearm, and that's what's happening. It's so much easier to convert an assault into a homicide in the U.S. than it is in the U.K. For instance, even if there are far more assaults in the U.K. than there are in the U.S. So that seems, and of course that's a consequence of our Second Amendment. I don't have a strong opinion on that. I'm not like a total anti-gun person. I'm not a total for-gun person. I'm just pointing out that this is the consequence. That if you want to allow people to have largely unfettered access to firearms, now some of those people are going to convert their arguments or assaults into homicides as a consequence. Now, most of those 15,000 are gang violence. So these are mostly concentrated in poor impoverished, high stress neighborhoods in big cities or in rural areas that are also very poor or impoverished, like Appalachia, that kind of stuff. So it's not a race thing. You see this in white Appalachia. You see this in downtown Chicago. It's like very poor people who are very stressed, who have a lot of problems in their neighborhood. Their neighborhoods are underserved in a lot of different ways. There are a lot of gangs, and most of those deaths, including the underage deaths, are gang members. So you have 14-year-old gang members who die in a shooting, and they get included in the child deaths. Although sometimes there are also accidental. Two gangs are having a shootout, a baby gets hit. That does happen as well. But in terms of like it just, for the experience of a tourist, say, just don't go to those areas. I mean, it sounds terrible, like really callous, but like walking around Orlando, am I worried about this? No, but I know what neighborhoods not to go to in Orlando. Yeah. Wouldn't go there anyway, because it's not like where Disney is.
So, you know what I mean? Are those dangerous areas known to everyone, including visitors, so that when I come to the United States of America, I should know where to go to?
You just ask somebody, like, is there a particular place I should avoid in Orlando, for instance? People tell you, don't go to Pine Hills, don't go to Buffalo. That's the kind of thing, and there are two places you would never go to anyway. There's nothing there, that you would want to see, so it's very unlikely. Every so often you hear these horrible stories that like a tourist GPS device completely failed, and brought them to, the worst section of Miami. There actually was a case from decades ago that happened to a German, tourist. But that's incredibly, incredibly rare. Again, it's not to say that we should be callous about these people who are dying. There's still deaths. There's still people that we should be serving better than we are, obviously. But we don't have a spate of tourist deaths in the U.S. because the tourists don't go to those places, and if you're fortunate enough, to be born and raised in a neighborhood that isn't, doesn't experience that, then you're not going to be the victim of anything like that either. Yeah. Most of us, I'm 53. I've never been the victim of a violent crime.
Yeah. Have you ever seen a mass shooting in your life?
No, nobody's actually seen it. So most shootings are gang violence. Most mass shootings are gang violence. So it's a bit of a people are thinking like school shootings when I think of that. Most of them are not. No, most of them are gang. They're just gangs in a bad neighborhood. Two gangs facing up, blasting away at each other.
What about schools? Schools are also soft targets.
Yeah, but they happen, but it's pretty rare. It's not very common to see.
There was a shooting somewhere around 2017 or so in Orlando. That was the first time I got to know about this city, the name of this city, Orlando, at a nightclub. So what?
Most shooters are not Muslim, right? You know what I mean? So it just happened to me in this case. He might have been radical, in that zone. Most shooters don't belong to any particular religion or ideology. They're just unhappy people that do horrible things. They're not particularly gamers either, because I know that comes up as like, wow, does video games have? No, if anything, they play fewer violent video games. They come from all ethnicity. Some of them are white, some of them are black, some of them are Latino, some of them are Asian. They come from all religions, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, so on and so forth.
Definitely. Religion doesn't have anything to do with.
No, it's people sometimes, adhere to like these very extreme, like Christian nationalism, or perhaps like radical Islam, or even, like fundamental Buddhism. There have been Buddhist killers, which sort of seems weird in a way. We always think of Buddhism as being super peaceful, So it's just whatever belief system. These are people that take it way to an extreme, and any belief system can be corrupted in that way. So it's nothing foundational to any of these religions or faiths that, and most shooters are not religious at all. Most shooters have nothing to do with religion. So
definitely. Because there was a time when some people carried out a mass shooting in France, and when a journalist did some digging, he discovered that before they went on that rampage, they had to sell a bar that they had owned before they even collected the money to go and conducted that sort of thing. So the next thing that I would like us to talk about with you is those people like me who might have some, not doubts, but some fear of coming to the United States of America simply because of the mass shooting. Uh,
Yeah.
what would you say to us?
You're more likely to get your ass kicked in France than experience any violence coming to the U.S. Now, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. It's not a thing. It's not a thing you see.
Yeah. So,
I was more scared in Paris than I've been in most American cities. Let me show you
oh
that.
my God, what happened? I think Paris is one of the most peaceful places, I would say.
As long as you stay downtown, yes. What I did is I like to walk in cities for the most part, and so I was going to walk between downtown Paris, which is absolutely beautiful, to Saint Denis, which is where like the cathedral. There's another, not Notre Dame, another
Yeah.
cathedral where the kings are buried. And that's a pretty long walk. It's maybe a couple hours walk, but I like to walk. So I was like, so the area you gradually go from like the nice, beautiful downtown to disaster in Paris, and just incredibly impoverished. Obviously, mentally ill people screaming in the street. I mean, it was eye-opening, as an American, like, holy crap, this is pretty bad.
Why are you afraid?
So
Why are you
that's why
afraid?
I did. I got the subway. So I was like, no, I'm all set.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
as an American, I was intimidated by Paris. Put that into perspective. No, you'll be fine. I mean, just as long as you have a sense of like where you want to go, like what things you want to see, you'll be fine. And like I said, most like most European cities, most American cities have some bad parts. And as long as you avoid those bad parts, you should be okay. And
Well,
like I said, our rate of tourist death is incredibly, minuscule.
oh,
So it's, can I say it won't ever happen? I can't say it won't ever happen if you go to Australia, Sydney or something like
yeah.
that. So, but your odds are pretty good.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. So,